Before kings, before laws, before the world even had a name for it, empires already owned you. And you didn't even notice. Do you honestly think you could have survived? The first 10 seconds of your life in an ancient city weren't about freedom. They were about the blueprint of your control, drawn 5,000 years ago. Close your eyes. Smell the wood smoke and the sun-baked mud of Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad. You see farmers rushing through the streets in a silent, creeping panic. But the real danger isn't a soldier with a sword. It's the man in the shadow with a clay tablet and a reed pen. The scribe. The silent architect of your debt. He knew how much you ate. He knew how much you owed. He knew how to break you without ever raising a whip. What would you do if you couldn't own your own body? What if every grain of wheat you harvested belonged to a ghost? This is the origin of the invisible system. A system that didn't need a single written law to put you in chains. People moved to these rising cities for safety. They wanted protection from the desert and the raiding tribes. They thought they were finding a sanctuary behind high walls. They were actually walking into a beautifully designed cage. The invisible chains were forged while they slept. Farmers worked until their spines literally snapped under the weight of the quota. Families lived in a shivering, constant fear of the next harvest. Children were pulled from their play to become cogs in a massive, grinding machine. But here's the shock. There were no formal laws yet. No code of Hammurabi to tell you what was right or wrong. Instead, there was a primitive operating system of survival. If you wanted to eat, you followed the rhythm of the city. If you wanted to live, you became a number in the empire's inventory. The suspense was built into the very air you breathed. Every person knew that one bad season meant more than hunger. It meant becoming the property of the state, losing your name forever. Let's talk about the ultimate weapon of the ancient world, wheat. You think empires are built on gold? No, they are built on calories. Empires understood a dark secret. Control the food, and you control the spirit. They didn't need to lock you in a cell to own your loyalty. They just needed to control the massive doors to the granary. Food was rationed with a cold, clinical precision that would shock you. Scribes calculated exactly what a laborer needed to survive. Not a handful more, and certainly not a handful less. They kept you exactly on the edge of the void. Starvation was the lever they used to move the masses. Work harder, or your children's bowl stays empty tonight. But here's the part no one talks about. The peasants weren't just victims. They were silent, desperate survivors. Some secretly hoarded grain in the dirt floors of their huts. They risked immediate execution for a single bag of barley, because they knew that barley was the only thing that gave them power. In the dark of night, grain was traded like a forbidden drug. This was the empire's greatest masterpiece, turning a biological need into a political chain. Now imagine the burning sun on your neck. You are hauling a stone heavier than your own body weight. There is no law saying you must do this, but there is a quota, and the quota is absolute. Labor wasn't just about building monuments, it was about keeping you too tired to ever dream of a revolution. If you were working 16 hours a day, you aren't plotting. You were just trying to find a place to collapse. The empire didn't just want your work. They wanted to own your total exhaustion, and they were experts at it. But here's the unexpected part. Compliance didn't just come from the lash. It came from a toxic mix of fear and a tiny, pathetic reward. A double ration of beer, a piece of salted fish. They gamified survival before games even existed. They turned human effort into a cold balance sheet of profit. Imagine you were there, your back is breaking, but they offer you that extra ration. What would you do? Would you work harder for a piece of fish? This is how the system turned your own survival instinct against you. This is where the invisible chains got personal. The scribes, the eyes that never blinked. recorded everything. How many goats you had, how much grain you harvested, how many sons you had who were old enough to carry a spear. To a farmer, writing was a form of terrifying dark magic. A scribe could draw a few marks on a wet piece of clay. And suddenly, your family owed a debt for the next 50 years. One single mistake in those records could ruin 10 generations. There was no court of appeals for the poor. The clay tablet was the final, unchangeable word of the state. Literacy was the ultimate gatekeeper. It created a wall between the rulers and the silent, broken people who were ruled. If you couldn't read the record, you couldn't argue with your fate. But here's the twist. The scribes were often as corrupt as the kings. They would lose a debt for a bribe, or they would add a tax to a family they simply didn't like. The information age didn't start with computers. It started with a stylus and a lump of mud in a dusty, dark office. But physical and economic control was only the foundation. To truly own a population, the empire needed to own the very contents of your soul. Enter the priests and the concept of the divine mandate. The gods were used to enforce a social order that favored the crown above all else. If the king wanted a new palace, it wasn't presented as his personal greed. It was a vision sent directly from the great protector of the sky. To disobey the system was not just a crime against man. It was a crime against the universe itself. The priests were the first true psychologists. They knew how to use omens to bend the people's stubborn will. A solar eclipse wasn't an astronomical event to the common man back then. It was a terrifying warning that the grain taxes must be increased immediately. A flood wasn't a natural disaster. It was a sign of divine anger. It meant the labor quotas weren't being met by the lazy and the sinful. Rulers would often fake these omens to get exactly what they wanted. They turned the sky into a massive billboard for their own propaganda. You might think laws came first to help the people achieve justice. But here is the shock. The system didn't wait for a judge to sit on a bench. The system was breathing down your neck before the ink was even dry. Let's put a human face to this ancient grinding pressure. Meet Enkum. He is a simple farmer in a small village located near the city of Ur. He has 3 young daughters and a wife who is growing weak from hunger. The empire's collectors have already taken 60% of his hard-earned crop. But Enkum knows the coming winter will be cruel and long, so he does something unthinkable and incredibly dangerous for his family. Under the cover of a moonless, silent night, he digs a deep hole. He buries 2 large jars of grain beneath his family's dirt hearth. He covers it with earth and hides it with a ragged, dusty old rug. For months, he lives in a state of absolute paralyzing terror. Every time a group of soldiers walks past his hut, his heart stops. Every time a neighbor looks too closely at his children's healthy faces. Because his children aren't as skinny as the other children in the village. This is where the invisible chains got personal. The system is designed to reward the neighbor who snitches for a crust of bread. His neighbor, hungry and desperate, notices the small difference. One morning, the soldiers arrive at Enkum's door without saying a word. They don't ask questions. They just start digging up the dirt floor. Enkum is dragged away in chains, and his neighbor is given the hidden grain. The empire didn't just punish Enkum for his theft against the state. They used him to teach the entire village that trust is a deadly, forbidden luxury. Now, consider the man who actually dragged Enkum away. His name is Saragon. He isn't a monster born from darkness. He was a farmer's son, just like Enkum was before the draft. But he was recruited during a particularly bad harvest for a steady meal. The empire offered him a spear and a bowl of hot stew. In exchange, he had to become the heavy hand that strikes his own people. Saragon is now told to spy on his own village and report the weak. He knows who is hiding grain. He knows who is whispering against the king. If he speaks the truth, his childhood friends will die. If he stays silent and a scribe finds out, he is the one who faces the blade. Loyalty versus survival. This is the psychological cage. The system didn't just oppress the poor and the hungry, it corrupted the very souls of those who were forced to serve it. Saragon sleeps with his sword unsheathed, fearing the people he grew up with. Imagine being him. Every friend is a potential executioner. High above the mud huts, in the cool shadows of the great temple, a young scribe named Nani is shivering despite the heat. He has found a massive, undeniable error in the regional tax records. 10 families have been overtaxed for 3 years due to a simple smudge. They have lost their ancestral land. They have sold their children into slavery, all because of a single careless mark on a wet clay tablet. Nani has the power to fix it with one stroke of his reed pen. He has the stylus in his hand, and the room is quiet for a moment. But his superior is standing in the doorway, watching his every move. To admit the error is to admit that the Empire's machine is fallible. And the Empire is never, ever allowed to be wrong in the eyes of the public. Nani looks at the names of the broken people on the clay. He knows these families. He knows the weight of their undeserved pain. But if he changes the record, he will be executed for forgery. He wipes his eyes and presses the stylus firmly into the gray clay. He doesn't fix the error. Instead, he doubles the debt to hide the mistake. He chooses his own life over the lives of 50 desperate strangers. This is how the system turns good, honest men into hollow ghosts. This is the reality of the Empire timeline we are exploring together, where we trace the invisible chains of power from the very beginning. We don't just look at the dates of kings and the maps of battles. We look at the human cost of what the world calls greatness. We must look at the silent wars fought in the shadows of the pyramids. If you are feeling the weight of these stories, you are finally starting to see the pattern. Why did this system work even without a single written law? Because the Empire controlled the very geography of your existence. They designed the cities as a map of hierarchy and constant observation. The closer you lived to the center, the more protected you were by the walls. But the closer you lived, the more you were observed by the temple guards. Survival was a trade-off that everyone had to make every single day. Every rebellion was already accounted for in the Empire's dark logic. Every secret hoard of grain was expected to happen eventually. The Empire didn't try to stop every single crime or act of defiance. They just made the price of the crime so high that few were willing to pay it. Bribes were not a failure of the ancient system. They were a feature. Bribes kept the lower officials happy and the common people deeply indebted. It was an ecosystem of corruption that kept everyone complicit in the machine. So, who really benefited from this cycle of misery? The king? Perhaps he slept on gold, but he lived in constant fear of his court. The priests? Certainly, they held the keys to the granary and the gods. But the ones who truly thrived were the ones who learned to adapt first. The ones who learned how to manipulate the records for their own survival. They weren't the heroes of the stories. They were the clever survivors. This brings us to the great twist, the one they don't teach you in school. We are taught that the Code of Hammurabi was a leap forward for human justice. We are told it brought order to a lawless world. But the shocking truth is that laws weren't the start of control. They were the final, heavy stamp on a system that already owned your life. The law was codified to justify the brutal control that already existed. It wasn't created to protect the farmer from the tax collector. It was created to give the Empire a legal reason to seize his harvest. When the law says an eye for an eye, it sounds fair on the surface. But it's really saying that your body is a productive asset of the state. If you damage another's worker, you owe the state a debt of flesh. The law made the invisible chains finally visible to the naked eye. But by the time the laws were carved in stone, it was far too late to break them. The system had already won the war for the human spirit centuries before. It had turned human behavior into a manageable science. The law was merely the lock on a door that had already been closed. Take a deep breath and look at the world you inhabit right now. We have digital records that track every single cent we spend and move. We have credit scores that determine the quality of our future lives. We have a global food system that is controlled by a handful of giants. Does any of this sound familiar to the dirt floors of ancient Sumer? Would you have survived the first empires, or would you have vanished? Would you have been another name lost in the broken records of time? Would you have been Inkem, digging in the dirt to save his dying children? Or would you have been Saragon, holding the spear to save your own skin? We like to think we are different from our ancestors, that we are evolved. But the mechanisms of control are universal and they never truly die. They just change their clothes and their names to fit the current era. They move from clay tablets to fiber optic cables and satellite feeds. The human struggle remains exactly the same as it was in the dust. The struggle to remain an individual in a system that wants you to be a number. I want to hear from you, the listeners who have followed me into the past. If you were transported back to ancient Sumer with only your will, what would be your first move to survive the shadow of the temple? Would you try to climb the ranks of the scribes and manipulate the clay? Or would you lead a rebellion that history has forgotten to mention? Drop your answer in the comments, because I read every single one of them. Your voice is the one thing the system cannot fully record or control yet. If you want to see how empires weaponized food to break nations, then you need to subscribe to the Journey of the Empire timeline. In our next episode, we are going deep into the history of the Hunger Wars. We will explore how the manipulation of the Nile changed the fate of Egypt, and how a single drought became the deadliest weapon in the royal arsenal. Don't just watch history pass you by. Understand the mechanics of power. Stay curious, stay skeptical of the records, and stay human. And most importantly, keep watching the shadows for the men with the pins, because the system is always watching you, even when you sleep. See you in the next chapter of the struggle. See you in the next timeline. The patterns of power do not fade with the passing of time. They simply sink deeper into the soil of our daily routines. If we look closer at the ruins of Akkad, we find something even more disturbing than forced labor or heavy taxes. The first empires didn't just want your sweat, they wanted your lineage. They created the first inheritance laws to ensure debt was a permanent legacy. If a father died owing the state, the son was born with a chain already around his neck. This was the birth of generational poverty as a tool. The scribes would wait at the birth of a child, not to celebrate a new life, but to calculate a new future asset. They calculated the future calories that child would consume, and the decades of work they would owe to the crown. In the eyes of the empire, a baby was not a miracle. It was a future unit of production, a cog waiting for its turn in the machine. This realization is what truly broke the spirit of many who tried to resist. How can you fight a system that has already spent your grandson's labor? How can you rebel when the very ground you stand on is leased from a king who claims to be a god? The psychological weight was absolute. It created a culture of deep, silent compliance that lasted for millennia. But even in this darkness, there were flashes of the human spirit. We find records of hidden villages deep in the marshes where the scribes feared to go. The outcasts, the debt dodgers, the brave. These were the ones who chose the harsh life of the swamp over the safety of the cage. They were the first true rebels of history. They lived on fish and reeds, far from the ration lines and the watchful eyes of the temple. They had no gold, but they had their time. The empire called them barbarians to scare the city dwellers from joining them. Propaganda made freedom look like a terrifying death sentence. "Outside these walls is chaos," the priest would scream. "Outside these walls, the gods will not hear your prayers or protect your soul." This is a tactic that has never gone out of style. The fear of the outside. It keeps the workers in the factory and the soldiers in the barracks. But the records show that despite the fear, people still fled into the marshes every year. They chose the unknown over the invisible chain. As we look back at these first systems, we must ask, what are we fleeing today? What are the marshes of the modern world? Is it the disconnection from the digital grid? Is it the return to local living? Or is it simply the act of thinking for yourself? The Empire timeline is not just a journey into the past. It is a mirror held up to our present reality. Every tool of control we see in Sumer has a modern, shinier equivalent. The ration card became the credit card in your pocket. The temple scribe became the data analyst in the skyscraper. The divine omen became the algorithmic prediction on your screen. The gods have changed their names, but they still demand our total attention. They still demand that we justify our existence through production. But remember the marshes. Remember Income's hidden grain and Nanny's hidden guilt. The system is vast, but it is made of people. And people are unpredictable. Even the most perfect cage has a loose wire if you know exactly where to look. Even the most powerful empire eventually crumbles under the weight of its own greed and the silence of its people. In the end, Mesopotamia was reclaimed by the desert sands. The kings who thought they were immortal are now just dust and broken pottery. What remains is the human story. The story of the struggle to be free in a world that wants us bound and recorded. If this deep dive has opened your eyes, then our mission is working. History is not a dead subject. It is a living, breathing warning. Thank you for walking through the dust of the first cities with me today. You are now part of a community that looks beyond the surface. We are the ones who dig for the truth beneath the hearth. We are the ones who remember the names the scribes tried to erase. Be sure to join us for the next chapter, where we watch the system grow even more sophisticated as the world expands. We will see how the first coins replaced the first grains, and how debt became a weapon that could cross oceans. The story is only getting darker, and the stakes are getting higher. Until then, keep your grain hidden and your mind sharp. Never stop questioning the hand that feeds you. The timeline is long, but the truth is eternal, and it belongs to you. This is the end of our first major exploration into the invisible system. Stay tuned for the Hunger Wars, coming very soon. Your journey through the Empire timeline has only just begun. Stay safe, stay free, and we will talk again in the shadows of the next empire.